China, 1945. With the surrender of Japan, World War II came to an end, but the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalists and Mao Zedong's Communists, a struggle dating back to the 1920s that had only been suspended during the battle against the Japanese, was about to resume. Seymour Topping had been entranced with China since high school. He was 25 and just out of the U.S. Army when he met the Asian editor of the wire agency INS, the International News Service, in the Philippines.
And he offered me a job as a stringer, as a part-time correspondent in Peking. I got on an airplane, and my title at that point was chief correspondent for North China and Manchuria. My salary was $50 a month.
Seeking both to prop up Chiang's nationalists and avoid all-out civil war, U.S. President Harry Truman sent America's most distinguished general, George Marshall, to mediate. John Roderick had worked for the Associated Press in the U.S. before the war. Drafted in 1942, he was sent to China. As soon as he left the military, he rejoined the AP in Chongqing, Chiang's wartime capital. There, he got to know the Communists' key envoy in the negotiations, Zhou Enlai.
When you were with them in Chongqing, as I was many times later, at dinner or otherwise, he always concentrated on you. He may take one quick glance around the room, the restaurant you might be in, then he just concentrated on you. It made you feel important.
Henry Lieberman was appointed the New York Times China correspondent in 1945. He was equally impressed with Zhou Enlai, but at a conference of American China hands nearly 40 years later, concluded Zhou's charm was just a show to win over Western reporters.
Zhou Enlai is one of the greatest people I've ever encountered in terms of his charm, but in his mental ability, his skills, and one of the most important things of all, I think, is the fact that he was one of the world's greatest actors.
25-year-old Roy Rowan had always wanted to be a foreign correspondent, but leaving the Army, he couldn't find a reporting job. So strong was the lure of China, however, that Rowan took a position with the UN's Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, in Shanghai, a city like no other.
It was just a wild, sort of a cacophony of various noises and sounds and lights and neon. I mean, I was overwhelmed. Landing there with UNRWA, with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, I was stuck in this little hotel called the Great Eastern on Nanking Road, nicknamed the Greastern, as we called it. And this was really a whorehouse, I think.
Rowan's job was to escort UN relief convoys, often putting him right in the middle of the conflict.
UNRWA trucks and even the railroad trains full of supplies were being attacked all the time by both nationalists and communists. The nationalists pretending it was communists and the communists pretending it was nationalists. But our trucks were constantly being commandeered.
Neither Mao's communists nor Chiang's nationalists were serious about a political compromise. Phil Potter covered the Marshall Mission for the Baltimore Sun.
These two parties had total mistrust of each other, and there was no way possible in which they could be brought together by General Marshall or anybody else. Chiang Kai-shek was not going to give the Chinese communists any part in the government. That's why I wrote the story. He thought he could win by military means.
But as Marshall continued his fruitless efforts at mediation, the Communists allowed American reporters access to Yan'an, their headquarters in the remote Northwest. Zhou Enlai helped get permission for John Roderick to go.
Zhou Enlai was instrumental in this. So a month after I'd become a foreign correspondent, I had this plum assignment, which was to go to Yan'an and meet the Chinese communists.
Between late 1945 and early 1947, John Roderick spent 7 months in Yan'an, in almost daily contact with Mao and other communist leaders.
I saw Mao practically every day during that time. You met in the small downtown area, or you went for dinners or dances or things of that sort. He was a type of person, there was an inner strength in him, a stubbornness, a kind of a superior intelligence about him. During our conversation, he talked about many things, about the Marshall Mission, about the future of China and things like that, and so on and so on.
And Mao signaled to Roderick a desire for good relations with the United States.
Later he asked me, would somebody like Montgomery Ward or Sears be willing to come to China to start a mail order business? Because he said China was so big and the communication is so bad, that would be one wonderful thing.
When he interviewed Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong was eager to come to an understanding with the United States. It was able to make an arrangement whereby his dispatches were transmitted on the communist radio and picked up by the AP Monitor in San Francisco. There was so much anti-communist feeling in the United States, and that this interview did not get the attention that it deserved.
Also in Yan'an at that point was Sidney Rittenberg, a young American trained in Chinese by the U.S. Army, working, like Roy Rowan, for the UN Relief Agency. But the left-wing Rittenberg supported the communists and was often asked to translate for Mao and other top officials.
They were very open to Americans at that point. They were open to conversations. I think the main thing was the point that they were making at the time to all and sundry was the legitimacy of their regime. They had at the time, they had areas around 180 million population in China, scattered areas, mainly in North China.
But the nationalists still controlled the cities where most American reporters were based. Rutherford Pote spent time in Shanghai for United Press International.
We all lived in Broadway mansions, a big apartment house complex, and we went to our separate bureaus. And we had telephone service of sorts to Tokyo, but primarily I filed to Tokyo by telegraph.
Not all their time was taken up with the big story.
There was Reynolds' packet of the United Press. At one point, he did a story which got me a lot of queries, like other correspondents, about the discovery of a human-headed spider. When this story about the human-headed spider appeared, I got a cable from the International News Service saying, okay, but don't file unless you can find a spider with 2 human heads.
After 6 months in Beijing, the International News Service transferred Topping to the nationalists' capital, Nanjing, where he soon took a better-paying job with the AP. Nanjing was where he met Audrey Ronning, a student at Nanjing University and the daughter of a Canadian diplomat.
I went to school in a rickshaw from the Canadian Embassy to the Nanking University, and every morning you'd see corpses lying on the roads. In winter they froze to death, and some of them had mats over them, but people didn't want to claim them because they couldn't afford. So, and there were beggars all over the streets.
The homeless and starving filling the streets, hyperinflation, rampant corruption, all undercut Chiang Kai-shek's support in the countryside and in the cities.
And I was in Shanghai, covering Shanghai, what was happening there, reporting on the poverty and the contrast of life and so on. How we lived in the Broadway mansions, a very luxurious hotel, and below us in the sampans were the poor of China, drinking the water from the muddy canals and living their lives out in extreme poverty.
Fed up with corruption in the relief effort, Roy Rowan quit his job and was having a drink at Shanghai's famous Peace Hotel before returning to the U.S.
I was standing at the bar and sort of, didn't know what the hell I was going to do. I didn't have a lot of money, and I was going to go home and have to look for a job. And I was standing next to this gentleman, Bill Gray, it turned out, and we got talking.
Gray was the Time Life bureau chief in China. He asked Rowan to write a piece about what he'd seen in the countryside. A month later, Rowan was the Life magazine China correspondent.
The reason they were in so much of a hurry for me to get back was, one, things were pretty active, but two, John Purcell was then the Life correspondent, and he evidently had refused pretty much to go into the combat areas.
Rowan had no such qualms. He teamed up with photographer Jack Burns. From his UN days, Rowan had connections with the American pilots flying for Zhang's Civil Air Transport, or CAT. Many of them were veterans of General Claire Chennault's famous Flying Tiger Squadron during World War II.
When I went back as a correspondent, the first thing I did was to go out to Lunghua Airport where the CAT, or the China Air Transport headquarters was, and see some of my old pilot buddies, and realize, because you couldn't telephone to Taiwan or Suzhou or even Beijing. You could telephone maybe to Nanking if you were lucky, but the only way you could find out what was going on was to fly around with these guys and just hopscotch around the country, and with no particular destination in mind other than there's somewhere where it was where there was a war going on.
Life and Time were the two leading American news magazines. Both had been founded and were run by Henry Luce, born in China of missionary parents, deeply conservative, and a committed supporter of Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists. In 1945, Luce had fired Time's star wartime China correspondent Theodore White for critical coverage of the Nationalists. White had collaborated with fellow Time correspondent Annalee Jacoby on a book called Thunder Out of China, warning that the unpopular and corrupt Kuomintang was in danger of losing to the communists. In the U.S., their message fell on deaf ears.
It was impossible to convince people that the communists were going to win the war. There wasn't any feeling in this country that there was anything wrong with the Kuomintang government, that they weren't honest Christian Democrats, that they weren't beloved by their people, and would win a well-deserved triumph with no trouble at all.
Jacoby recalled an episode in which an interview she did with Chiang Kai-shek was completely rewritten by Time's virulently anti-communist foreign editor, Whittaker Chambers.
I had an interview with Chiang Kai-shek once. The next week came Time magazine with several pages of an interview full of questions I did not ask, and with answers which Chiang Kai-shek did not give. Massively anti-communist diatribe, anti-communist stories which were not true. I would never have asked those questions. And Chiang Kai-shek, in spite of his hatred of communists, would never have given those answers. Whittaker Chambers had sat in New York and made up dialogue to put in the mouth of the head of one of our allies.
Roy Rowan and Jack Burns tried to ignore Luce as much as they could.
We were well aware of what Luce's position on China. Jack and I were well aware of it. However, we didn't think about it much because, one, we were interested in seeing action.
Indeed, it was the thrill of covering combat as much as being in China that drew Rowan to the country.
You get a high out of this. I mean, it's like alcohol, or where you build up to a level of excitement, and then when it's no longer there, when you feel a big letdown.
But they couldn't avoid Luce's influence. A report on a battle south of Shanghai, where Burns photographed nationalist troops who decapitated the communist commander and mounted his severed head on a wall, was never published. Nor was this feature on refugees with nowhere else to go, forced to seek shelter in a mortuary. The flaws of the nationalists, and frustration at not always getting reports on the issue published, shaped the way many American correspondents came to view the communists.
There was a great deal of admiration among the correspondents for the communists. And we had had such close acquaintance with the nationalist officials, nationalist forces, and we'd seen that the extent to which they were infected with corruption. The general feeling at that point was that we were looking at the Chinese Communist forces essentially as reformers.
Anybody that was well informed in Nanking at the time realized that the communist victory was inevitable. they were going to win, no matter. I mean, there we were, the diplomats and the nationalists living like maharajas. Great parties every night. People were starving in the streets. I was driving home one night from a party with a nationalist officer in one of these great black cars, and the people on the streets were eating grass. And I said, oh, this is such a terrible situation, you know, and I can't stand it, and it must be worse for you as a Chinese. And he said, we don't consider them people. And I thought, well, you know, no wonder there's a revolution.
In retrospect, I think that a lot of the criticism of the Kuomintang was based on the fact that an awful lot of people were living in Kuomintang areas and could see what was going on. What was happening in communist areas, we didn't know anything about.
Indeed, with the collapse of the Marshall Mission, the Civil War escalating, and the U.S. clearly on Chiang Kai-shek's side, Mao's forces were no longer so welcoming to American reporters, as Seymour Topping discovered when he tried to cross into communist territory.
At a roadblock, we encountered communist guerrillas, and that was the closest call I had. One of them was pointing a machine gun, a Tommy gun, at me, and kept yelling at me, "Who are you?" And I could see his fingers on the trigger of the machine gun, and so they took me as a prisoner.
Meanwhile, with the help of Henry Luce, Roy Rowan got an interview with Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek did not grant interviews to the press, but because of Luce, he agreed to see us in Beijing, and the madam served as the interpreter. He tried to convince us that he had things well in hand, and they had big wall maps and pointers and, you know, doing the whole dog and pony show for us about where the nationalists were in Manchuria, where the communists were, and how they were going to had a very, very good defense set up and so forth.
Manchuria, or northeast China, was the country's industrial heartland and a key agricultural base. The communists and nationalists had been fighting over it for months. Having heard Chiang Kai-shek's confident boasts, Rowan and Burns set out on a China Air Transport, or CAT, plane for the Manchurian city of Mukden, today's Shenyang, to see the situation for themselves.
So we went right from that meeting with Chiang Kai-shek, hopped one of the CAT planes and went up there, and then found us. As soon as we landed, we could see that everybody was trying to get the hell out of town and evacuate anybody with any money. Troop trains were going by with nationalist soldiers hanging on the outside all over the engine, moving south.
The communists were at the city gates. In downtown Mukden, at the U.S. consulate, they found American diplomat Angus Ward, a larger-than-life figure who'd been ordered by Washington to stay on and establish contact with the triumphant communist forces.
The epitome of an international spy, fluent in several languages, Chinese, Russian, very imposing. We took pictures of him, talked to him, I guess, for an hour, and he finally, you could hear gunfire. He finally said, "You better get your asses out the airport." And luckily for us, CAT always kept one plane at all of these airports where there was fighting going on, and to get their last guys out, their own guys.
Rowan and Burns got the last flight from Mukden's chaotic airport. They realized they had an exclusive. No one else knew the city had fallen. It was a story even Henry Luce's Life magazine couldn't ignore. Rowan and Burns got a 5-page spread. But U.S. diplomat Angus Ward was imprisoned in his consulate by the victorious communist troops, held hostage for 18 months before being allowed to return home. It wasn't only in North China that Chiang Kai-shek's authority was unraveling. Doak Barnett was the China correspondent for the Chicago Daily News. As Mukden fell, he took a trip from Shanghai through southern China.
Stopping off all along the way from Shanghai to Canton, and we got off and we saw an enormous number of people of all kinds, and at the end of that trip I wrote a long piece saying there's just no basis for any resistance anymore. There's no basis on the part of it. The officials we met had lost total confidence in the ability of the regime to survive. The intellectuals had lost total confidence, and ordinary people had lost total confidence.
And we saw the wounded being hauled back from central China and just dumped off the train.
And it was that more than it was the loss of Mukden, as far as I was concerned. I mean, it was just clear that politically there was no basis anymore.
With the communists in control of the north, the battle for central China began. Hoping to cover it, Seymour Topping went to a town called Bangbu, where he spent Christmas 1948 holed up in a Jesuit mission.
I would report to Harold Milks, who was in Nanking, about what was happening and so on. And on Christmas Eve, after I had filed one of my last reports, Harold Milks wrote a brief story saying that Seymour Topping is the loneliest man in the Associated Press this Christmas Eve.
By now, Audrey Ronning, whose father Chester remained the senior Canadian diplomat in Nanjing, had been evacuated back to Canada.
And I was walking down the street one rainy night and with some friends going to a movie. And I kicked over a newspaper that was on the street. And it went into the gutter. I picked it up, it was the Vancouver Sun. And on the front page, there was a little box that said, "Perhaps the loneliest man in the world tonight is Seymour Topping. The loneliest man in the world this Christmas Eve was Seymour Topping, who's in a monastery in Pengpu." And I thought, oh my, I better write and answer his letters.
Soon after, the two were married. What became known as the Huai Hai campaign in central China lasted 65 days. It involved over 1 million men, the biggest land battle since World War II, and it was a decisive victory for the communists.
That morning in January of 1949, on the battlefield of the Huai Hai, I knew it was all over for Chiang Kai-shek.
There was not a conflict among the press at all on the nature of the conflict. We knew that the nationalists were done, that they had done themselves in many ways. There was no hope for the nationalists, and it was impossible for the United States to turn the tide.
I was positive by this time that the nationalists could not prevail. There's no way. There's so much corruption. So many of the generals were going into combat and selling their arms and taking the payrolls and depositing it back into their own bank accounts in Shanghai. Not too long before it was over in China, Luce called me back for lunch. I went all the way back for lunch. It's a long way to go for lunch, especially when you're flying in prop planes. I told him what was happening. I told him he was gone, actually. And he was deeply, deeply hurt or unhappy by what I told him. There's no question about it.
In early 1949, Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. In April, the communists occupied his capital, Nanjing.
I decided that I would try to cover the actual taking of the city. So I picked up a friend of mine, a Chinese correspondent. His name was Bill Guan of the French news agency, Agence France Presse. In my Jeep, which I was driving, the AP Jeep, we decided to meet the communists coming in the Northwest Gate. They were exhausted. They had been fighting. So we took off and we went to a telegraph office. And Bill Guan and I quickly wrote some some things, and we flipped a coin as to who would file first. And Bill Guan won. And I wrote a short, detailed dispatch. When when Bill's 3-word dispatch, "Reds take Nanking," reached the desk of the AFP in Paris, they waited for the rest of his material, and my dispatch was immediately put out by the AP, and it gave me a world beat on the fall of the city.
The next communist target was Shanghai.
We wanted to do a big essay on the last days of Shanghai, and then we worked like crazy on it, and we got wonderful stuff. The French club people kind of ignoring the war, going on with their cocktails and their tennis, and the lawn bowls out in the middle of the race course with the Brits, and we shot all of this, the nightclubs and the whorehouse bars down on the waterfront, and the execution of the black marketeers and the suspected agents that take them out in back of the railroad station and shoot them in the head. We spent a month doing this. This was going to be our big finale. We did this, what I thought was a big, wonderful essay. They never used it. Life never used it.
The Nationalists put up virtually no fight when they got right down to contact.
I saw the Nationalists, I saw them retreating down Nanking Road. I saw them crossing over the Garden Bridge, and a lot of them, and discarding their uniforms in the Wangpu and trying to buy civilian clothes, and by this time there was a lot of smoke rising off in the Wusong area, and I saw the room boys and the Broadway mansions had all disappeared.
Rowan got out on one of the last flights to leave the city.
And I had this feeling that this here was this great, wonderful, wild, crazy city, and I remember looking down on the river and everything and thinking, I'll never come back here again, never be able to come back here again.